Hello everyone, this is Timothy with Computer-Aided Instruction. In this video series we've been talking about designing a web page, and in the last video we went about creating this page that you're looking at right now. We have several different containers on our screen, or should I say structure tags, such as nav, article, main, aside, and section. We also have a header with this image, and we have a footer with this sample text and some social media links. So in this video I want to spend some more time talking about using the float property and some issues that you might be faced when you're using it. So in this example here we have section this and the aside containers are both floating on the right hand side of the page, and I just want to show you something that might happen. I believe the effect that I'm going to be talking about is called margin collapse, but that's probably not the right term to be using, but it's essentially the same thing that's going to be happening. So in this example here of a web page I created, I have two containers that are floating. This one's on the right hand side of the page, this one's on the left hand side of the page. In this first row there's only two, in the second row I have 6 containers, in the third row I have 2 more containers, and then I have a paragraph which is not a container and it's not floating, but yet I have a margin top in this paragraph that should be pushing it away from this blue container, but it's kind of experiencing margin collapse because it's just lined up right up against this container. And I want to talk about why this is happening and what we can do to get the margin top to work properly so that this paragraph will be pushed down 100 pixels like this one is. So rather than just showing you the code that I already made to make this page, let's just go ahead and build it out from scratch. It'll just be good practice to watch me as I go about doing that. So I have, well, first of all, I'll just go ahead and say these are just 100 pixels high, 100 pixels tall, 100 pixels wide containers with a 1 pixel border, a solid line, and there's 10 pixels of space in between each container. So let's go ahead and get started building these out. So we have 10 containers in total. We don't necessarily need to build that many, but we'll just go ahead and do it. So let's create our first div tag. Actually, one thing I want to go ahead and say is that I want to keep all of my containers inside of a container. So I'm going to put all of these inside of the main section tag. So the first thing we want to do is create the opening main tag and the closing main tag. And then we'll have our first div tag, style equals, let's give it a border 1 pixel. Let me move my cursor I should say. So a border, let's give it a solid border of 1 pixel. Let's give it a width of 100 pixels, height of 100 pixels as well. Let's give it some padding. Let's give it some padding of 10 pixels. And what else should we do? That'll be good for now. Actually, no, we need to make it float to the right. And then we'll just copy this. And we'll make it float to the left. And then we need to have our closing div tags. Sorry about that. And in between our div tags we should really have some content. So paragraph, this will be right container 1, closing paragraph. And this will be left 1, closing paragraph. Save it. I already have this open in a new tab. Refresh it. Left and right one. Obviously I have a typo in my code somewhere. Let's save that. Style, border solid 1 pixel, width 100 pixels, float right, float left. This doesn't have a closing div. So there we have it. And we also have this greater than sign somewhere in the code. And I have this extra div tag, so let me get rid of that. Now this looks the way I want it to look. Now, if we want to have more containers that are going to be appearing not in this top row, but in a second row, let's go ahead and code that. So I'm going to take a shortcut and just copy these. So now we have 6 containers. So I'll call this row 2, right 1. And I'm going to have row 2, left 1. And this will be right 2 instead of right 1 again. This will be left 2. This will be row 2, right 3. This will be left 3. So let me save this, go to my page, refresh it. As you can see, everything is just lined up in one row. Simply having a space in between your code is not going to cut it. So what you want to type in here is clear, both, semicolon, saved, and now it's appearing in the next row. And if I want to have some space in between all of these different containers, I need to add some margins of 10 pixels, or however big of a margin you want. So like I was saying, clear both is basically saying, hey, the next thing that appears in your code needs to appear in the next row after you started using floats. So let me type in actually, I'm going to ignore this one. This one's right 1, which is right here. I don't need to add a right margin of 10 pixels. It's already against the screen. I want to add left margins for these, but I'm just going to use right margins just because I want to be able to copy and paste. So left 2, row 2, left 1, row 2, left 2 are going to need a right margin of 10 pixels. And then these 2 containers right here. This one is not going to need a right of 10 pixels because there's already a big gap here. So, and this one's not going to need a right margin either. So start here, margin right, 10 pixels. And then I'm just going to copy this and paste it over and over again. Save it, refresh. Looks good. Let me add a top margin as well. All of them are going to need a margin top, 10 pixels. But let's just give 1 and see what happens. Well, if I want the rows to be even, I'm going to have to give them all a margin top of 10 pixels. Or I could just be lazy and just give these 2 a margin bottom of 10 pixels, and that'll push everything down. But I want to make a point about that later, so I'll give them all a margin top of 10. So that looks pretty good. Now let's go back to our code. Let me copy these two. Add a space. This will be row 3. This will be row 3 as well. Save it, refresh, and we're good. I could make this wider to match this example and give it a color, a background color, and a thicker border, but I'm not going to bother with that. Now let me go ahead and go back to the code. Let me add a paragraph. Let me add a hello world message, close the paragraph. Let me save it. Now, I want you to see something that's going to happen. Where do you think this paragraph is going to appear on our web page? I didn't put the clear both, so do you think it's going to appear right here? It's actually going to appear at the very top of the page. Now, when you have containers or anything that's floating on the page, you have to look at it this way. This stuff is basically hovering over the web page. So the paragraph that I have, even though it's appearing beneath all this stuff on my in my code editor, it's actually going to appear at the very top of the page because the floating items are not on the page itself. They're hovering over the page. If we were looking at this three-dimensionally and we could change the axis of the web page, all of these will look like they're like hovering over the page and maybe casting shadows down. But the hello world message is not going to appear beneath it. It's going to appear besides whatever's floating. That's the cool thing about using floats. You can use it to make like a picture or a container line up against big blocks of text, and the text will curve around the containers, but it won't appear beneath the container unless you use clear colon both. So let me go ahead and add the clear both to prove my point. Actually, no, let me add some more text to this paragraph to show you what it looks like when it's wrapped around all of these different containers. So I'm going to click Save, refresh, and as you can see, the text is wrapping around all of the floating containers. Let me make it even longer. Whoa, what happened here? Control V, Control V, Control V a few times. So that's what it looks like when you have a continuous paragraph of text that's wrapped around a bunch of containers on the page. Looks pretty cool. And we could add some margin rights to help push the text away from the containers if we wanted to. Margin left and right and things like that. See, this one has a margin right. That's why the text is not pushed up against the edge of the container. This container did not have a margin right. This didn't have a margin left. This doesn't have a margin left. This doesn't have a margin right either. But this one does, so that's why we have a gap of space. So it would be a good idea to go ahead and add margin rights to these two containers and margin left to these two containers to keep the text from pushing right up against the edge of the containers. Or conversely, we could just add margin left and right to the paragraph. Let's go ahead and do that just to see what it looks like. So style equals margin left 10 pixels, margin right 10 pixels, and that should make us good. It's only pushing against the edge where it's not touching the containers. So what I would need to do is add the margins around the containers and not the paragraph itself. So whatever. I forget things myself sometimes, so nevertheless, it's good practice to just So yeah, adding a margin to your paragraph isn't going to help with floating elements, but adding a margin to the floating elements, the containers in this case, will push the text over. So anything that's floating has all of the power in this situation. So that's something that's interesting, and you need to keep it in mind. Now, if I want this if I want this paragraph to just appear beneath this row, all of the floating containers, I should say, let's go back in here. Style equals clear colon both semicolon, and there we go. It's appearing in the next row beneath all of these containers. Let me go back in here. Let me add a margin top 100 pixels. As we just demonstrated, this is not going to work. So it's not an issue of margin collapse. It's just an issue of if I want to have a gap of space, I would have to have a margin bottom for this container, which will push the paragraph down. But another solution is going to just simply be to put something in between the last floating tag and the next tag that you want to have like a margin. So I need to have something that's serving as a buffer between the last floating tag and the next tag. So I could add like a line break. I could add style equals clear colon both. And if I have clear both here, I don't need it here, so I can delete it here. Save it, refresh, and now I have my gap of 100 pixels because I have that line break, which is serving as a buffer and is clearing out the effects of the floats. So this 100 pixels is actually just kind of like pushing up against the line break tag. Most people would, instead of using a line break, they would use a div tag. Then they would just have a closing div tag. So this is a solution that a lot of people would use. But there's a better solution than this. So let me get rid of this. Actually, let me copy this. Let me delete this. Let me add this back to the style for the paragraph. Save it. Now, what you want to do is when you have items that are floating on your page, I want to have a container that contains the container that's floating or the picture that's floating and the text that you want it to be wrapped around the floating text, the floating container or picture or whatever the item is that's floating. I want to put all that stuff inside of a container. In this case, I have it all inside of the main section tags. And to the parent container, I'm going to add style equals overflow colon auto semicolon. Save it, refresh it, and there we go. So what overflow does is if you have a container, and let's just say the container is like 100 pixels tall, and then you had content inside of the container and it goes beyond the set height of the container. So if I had a paragraph that's like 200 pixels high, but the container is only 100 pixels tall, the container is not going to automatically stretch to conform to the content inside of it, but rather it's going to add a scroll bar so that the content inside of the container will be able to fit. But you just have to scroll to see it all. So let me go ahead and code this out so you can see what I mean. So let me make a copy of all of this. So let me make a copy of this. Instead of making a paragraph, I'm going to make it a container. Then I'll have my closed div here. Go back here. I'm going to set a height of just 75 pixels. And then I'll have my overflow of auto. Sorry. Now let's refresh the page. And as you can see, here's a scroll bar for this container. So that way, this paragraph was a lot taller than 100 or 75 pixels. So a scroll bar was added to make sure that all of it could be seen one way or another. If you don't like a scroll bar, there are other options you can use, but for now, we'll save that for a different lecture. So let me get rid of this. What overflow auto in this case is saying is like all of these floating elements need to stay within the main section tags. It needs to stay within this container. And basically the effect of the floating is not going to extend beyond the border of this container. Do I still need to have clear both? I believe I do, but let me get rid of it and see what happens. Actually, no, I don't need to have clear both since I have the overflow set to auto. And I'm getting 100 pixels of space between this grouping and this paragraph. But nevertheless, I'm going to put clear both because I'm paranoid and I don't know if that's going to work consistently across every browser. Now, was there anything else I wanted to talk about in this video? Let me think about it. Let me look at my... I think that's all I really wanted to talk about. Okay, actually no, there is something else I want to talk about. I want to talk about how you can organize things into rows without using floats at all, because as you can see, using floats is kind of a headache because you have to use overflow auto, you have to have clear both, and things like that. So another option for arranging things into rows is to use display block and display it as an inline block rather than a regular block. So let's see. Let me create 3 paragraphs. Let me get rid of this code. Let me have a closing paragraph tag. And then let me just copy and paste this 3 times. Let me save it and let me show you what this looks like. So we just have 3 paragraphs of Greek text. Now let me add in display colon inline block semicolon inline block with an E, and there's a dash in between inline and block. Let me copy this and replace these paragraph tags. Let me click save, and let's have a look at what this looks like now. Didn't make a difference, so what's wrong? I should probably limit the widths of these blocks. So let me add a width of just 100 pixels. Let me save it. Now you can see that these columns of text are aligned as blocks and they're side by side. Let me give these like a border. Instead of using paragraphs, let me just use divs. It's easier to think of it as containers rather than paragraphs. And let me give it a border, 1 pixel, solid. Let me copy this, replace this, and replace this. Save it, refresh. So that's another way of organizing things into columns. And this way you don't have to worry about the effects of floating and having things being pushed to the top of the page or anything like that if you didn't type clear both or clear left or clear right beneath it. So let me type in just like a paragraph. Hello world. Close paragraph. It's appearing beneath it. Let me add a margin top. Style equals margin top 100 pixels. Save it. Refresh. Yeah, didn't have to worry about adding the clear colon both. Property and value to my inline CSS code because I'm just using these are displayed as a block, an inline block, so it's just like having a bunch of rows. This is a lot more efficient than using floats. There's a time and a place to use floats, but if you can use inline blocks instead of floats to organize things in the columns on your page, that's probably a good idea. You're going to have to experiment with this on your own. I'm not going to go into this into too much more detail. But for now, I just give you two different ways of organizing things into columns. You could add some space in between these by using your margin left and right. Just add a margin of 10 pixels. That'll cover everything. Save it. Yeah, so hopefully this video was useful for you. So I hope you were able to get something out of this video. I highly recommend just using inline blocks if you want to organize things in the columns. If you want to have text wrapped around a container or a picture, that's when you want to use floats. But if you just want to have things like floating on your page and organized into columns and rows, you can certainly do that using the float tag. I mean, using the float property. Inline blocks is a little bit easier. But nevertheless, I just want to mostly just explain that there are multiple ways you can do things. You can organize content on your page. You can use tables to organize content. That's kind of old-fashioned. And if you want to make your website responsive, I would not recommend using tables at all for organizing different content on your page. Stick with using blocks and using containers that are floating. And there are ways that we could also make this more responsive by using media CSS code, but that's a lecture. That's a really, really complicated lecture that we'll talk about in a different series altogether. So thank you for watching this video. In the next video, we'll talk more about actually making your page look attractive. In the last few videos, we've been focusing on just throwing HTML and CSS code on the page and just seeing what sticks. But in the next few videos, I just want to focus on making your page actually look attractive and eye-catching. So stay tuned for that.